So, as I said, don't stress too much if you haven't actually seen Riverdale or know much of Archie. I'm kind of just using this as an example of what we can learn through the way that popular culture evolves over time. So we kind of touched on this a little bit even in the Star Wars session if you were in here before, and we talked about how even some of the essence of Star Wars has evolved as they've been making these movies over some, I don't know, what is it, almost 40 years now that they've been making these Star Wars movies. And so we actually see part of the story and the essence of that story changing as culture changes and the questions that people are asking are changing too. So I'm using this contrast between what I will refer to as classic Archie and Riverdale, the way that classic Archie has become what we see now on Netflix, the 2017 Netflix adaptation of the original Archie. There's something that I think we can actually learn from this as Christians who champion the gospel of Jesus into this world. What can we learn from the way popular culture evolves with time to actually find how we can communicate the gospel to an evolving and changing culture and generation? Does that make sense to everybody? So what I'm going to do is we're going to start in original classic Archie a little bit. We're going to look at the origins of Archie and what he was supposed to stand for. And then we'll move into what we find in Riverdale. Out of interest, who's watched Riverdale? Oh, good. That's way more people than last year, but there's a lot more people here than last year. So good, you guys will have some understanding of it. Of those people, who had some understanding of Archie before they saw Riverdale? Okay, so a few people who are sitting in the contrast who will have actually experienced the shock of that contrast. So I started reading Archie when I inherited my mum's Archie comics. So the comics I read as a child came straight out of like 1969. And so I kind of experienced this even though I'm the wrong generation to experience the contrast. So to start us off, we're going to watch a clip from what I am calling classic Archie.
Everything's Archie.
So there we have the Archie theme song, a cartoon series that was produced at the height of the comic book's popularity. I believe it was 1972 when they first debuted. And we could probably sit here and analyse that clip alone and come to some pretty accurate conclusions of what Archie was supposed to stand for, what values they held dear. Because I don't have time for the discussion, which I'd love to do, I'm just going to do a little bit of it as myself by going back into the history of Archie. So Archie and the gang, the key characters of Archie, originally were side characters alongside what you would consider a more conventional superhero called the Shield. So a lot of these superheroes, they emerged during World War II, kind of acted as entertainment propaganda. It was using these super strength guys to smash Hitler in the face, right? To give young readers hope in the power of America. And so the Shield was one of these superheroes. He was patriotic, he was super strength. Interestingly, to use Paul's word there, interestingly, the Shield actually predated Captain America by 18 months. So if you're wondering who came first there, it was actually the Shield. And originally they were almost identical, and so the reason Captain America has a round shield was because he was too similar to the character the Shield. They had to differentiate him somehow. So as they were producing these comic books, and the creators of the comic book realised that young readers were relating more and more to these side characters who were everyday teenagers. They were Jughead, Archie, Betty, Veronica. everyday teenagers that would help the Shield overcome his battle and his trials. And they realised that the kids seemed to be relating really well to these everyday teenagers. And in analysing this, what they realised is that while it was all well and good for these young readers to see these super strength guys take down the bad guy, it actually didn't help those young readers be equipped with the things that they would struggle with in their everyday life. And the reason people were gravitating to these teenage characters is because they were more like them. So the creators of Archie comic book are Richard Goldwater and Louis Silberkleit. These two guys, I'm going to move over here so you can see the screen better. These two guys started producing Archie comics in the late 1950s. They plucked Archie out of the Shield and they made him a headliner of his own comic book. And what they wanted Archie to be was the ultimate relatable hero. They wanted to see a hero who would go through the same things that their readers were going through and overcome them and learn something important at the same time. So Archie, if you know much about Archie, he is kind, he's well-meaning, he's a bit of the lovable fool. He was characteristically clumsy, and that's one of the things that kind of got a laugh out of you and got him into trouble, so that there'd be things that he would have to overcome. He was freckled, he was a little bit awkward, but he was still popular, and he dealt with the same kind of problems that the kids would deal with friendships, with their parents, with homework. There were two girls that liked him and he could never choose between them, so that's Betty and Veronica. And that storyline would become a reoccurring plot through the Archie narrative as it goes on, and in fact does remain a little bit in Riverdale. I'll get into that later. And Archie would stand for everything that was good and virtuous in this current time, climate and culture. He lived in a town called Riverdale. Riverdale was a nice, typical middle American town where you would meet your typical small town people. They were good people, they were educated people, they were mostly white, they paid their taxes, they mowed their lawns. They were everything that America wanted to see people to become at this time. And so these values became core to who Archie was and what he was able to communicate to this emerging generation. These values were in fact so important to Goldwater and Silberkleit that in 1973 they partnered with a Christian comic book company called Spire Christian Comics, and together in partnership with Spire Christian Comics they produced a dozen comic books where Archie and his friends preached an evangelical Christian message. Last year I actually had an example of this very comic book. I don't have it this year, unfortunately, but it's really in your face. Like, they're not subtle about it. They're walking into churches, they're hearing the gospel, they're telling their friends why we should believe in Jesus and not take drugs. And it's fascinating that 1973 we're talking about the absolute peak of Archie's popularity in popular culture. Now, think for a second of, like, what's a really, really popular franchise in popular culture at the moment? Someone give me an example. Marvel? Yeah, okay, Marvel. Let's say they make another, give me a Marvel hero. What's that? Iron Man. Let's say they make another Iron Man movie, right? And in this movie, Tony Stark, in a desperate crisis, walks into a church, hears the gospel and is converted. And then the rest of the movie is about him going around to all the other Marvel characters and trying to preach the gospel and see them come to know Jesus. Right? We're laughing because this is absolutely ridiculous. If we saw this happen here and now, that would be Iron Man and Marvel committing commercial suicide. People wouldn't just think it's ridiculous, they would actually get antagonistic and write off the franchise altogether. But when Archie started doing that exact same thing that I just described, nobody flinches, right? This is the culture of the time. You could do that in 1973 and it wouldn't damage his reputation as a popular culture figure. So even that in itself is speaking of how far our culture has come and the spaces where we can have that open message about Jesus. I just find that an interesting little observation. I find it more interesting because Goldwater and Silverclight, devout Jewish men. But for them, it was really important that Archie held true to those values. And when they saw the evangelical Christian message, they saw that it aligned with what they believed Archie stood for. And so it made sense to them that they would actually allow that to happen. I don't know if you've read the front there. Do you know this is one way? This is cool. The officer is witnessing to Archie. It's really typical of the corny humour. Riverdale, they were nice people. They were kind people. And if you had opened a comic book of the classic Archie, you would see wholesome characters, innocent characters, and it's all very light-hearted. Riverdale, on the other hand, wholesome, light-hearted, and innocent are three words that you would not use to describe this adaptation. So then my question is, how does this Archie that we find in the original comic books and everything that he stood for, how does he become the Archie Andrews that we find in Netflix Riverdale? Before we get stuck into that, let's watch a trailer from season 1.
Every corpse has a tale to tell. This one has the touch of evil.
Archie, our kid is dead. I saw you guys.
How do you feel about me? Is it real?
I'm asking you right now if you love me.
Who are you lying to?
I'm Breakfast at Tiffany's, but this place is strictly in cold blood. This should be fun.
Have you and Donnie Darko killed each other?
Nothing this bad was ever supposed to happen here. Maybe there's another side to the story.
Possibly it'll be Jason's wearing boots and me in this room.
This whole car is behind the no fingerprints.
You're a little more dangerous than you thought.
So just quickly, what are some observations that you guys make of the clip we've just watched in contrast to the first one? What are some of the differences? I know they're obvious, but speak them out anyway. Very sexualized, absolutely. You only need to see a minute trailer to actually identify that, yeah.
All the goodness is a sham.
Yes, fantastic observation. Yep.
The whole setting is dark, like visually
Yes.
darker, which obviously puts a whole different mood on everything.
Yep. And if you see the original comic books, they're all primary colours, light, bright, happy, 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 and they've gone for complete opposite, visuals. Anybody else?
Seems like there's a fair bit of sort of moral ambiguity, like it's not clear
Yes.
what's good and what's bad, it's just kind of...
Yep, a lot of grey, and that's well, I'll get onto that in a minute.
Tension between people,
Yeah, tension, like the relationships, nothing's kind of clean cut anymore. Things are much more complex in the Riverdale that we find.
The visual representations of love and how that's used, I find very interesting. In terms of, it's clear that it's a teacher at the start.
Yeah. Oh, one of my favourite twists on the original, and I'll get to that in a second too. And anyone who's seen it would know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't seen the original, you're in for a shock. I'm excited for it. So the 2017 adaptation of the Archie series is what we've just looked at here. And just to give you an idea of how popular this show is. So last year I think it was still only just streaming in the first season, or it only just finished streaming the first season. It's now aired the second season with plans for a third. In America, they had 2 million people tune into the premiere of season 2. So that was a huge jump on the first season. And this is just, if you go into the supermarket and you look at any teen magazine, these guys are on the front at the moment. So that's just to kind of give you an idea. And because I'm the next gen ministry facilitator, I'm always trying to think about what young people are consuming and the messages that they're happening. And And this is one of the things that they're all viewing and consuming at the moment. Now, on the surface, when you look at that, and because I was someone who did love the original Archie comic books, I was excited to see this. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually found this ridiculously entertaining. It's really trashy, it's not well acted or written, but you actually just can't stop watching it. They've got the formula down, you're addicted, you want to know what happens, and it's just kind of that guilty pleasure sort of viewing. But if you loved classic Archie, there is something about this where the cynic in me just rose up and went, oh, you're just trying to destroy something good. You know, you're just trying to knock down something that actually stood for something once. And as Matt Gray said it to me last year, you've pulled down Archie's pants and weed all over him. That's a very typical Matt Grayism, not exactly how I put it, but kind of shows some of that emotion that can rise up in you if you really did appreciate classic Archie. But as I actually began reflecting on it more, what have the creators tried to achieve here in adapting this beloved character for a modern audience? And the cynic in you can say that they're just trying to use shock value because that's what they do these days. But if you think about Archie as he was always supposed to be the ultimate relatable hero, who would go through the same challenges that a young person in that day and age would go through, I do think there is something where the creators have tried to stay true to that. What would it look like to have the relatable hero in 2017, 2018, 2019 struggle with the same things that young people, the typical 17-year-old in Western culture, is struggling with today? I actually think they've got it more accurate than you think. And it is shocking, but I think there's a good reason for that. And I think there's something important that we can learn from that contrast and that shock. So Riverdale in this adaptation is not as sweet as we knew it to be once upon a time. Still kind of got that nice small town vibe, but the show seems to be saying from the start, just scratch beneath the surface and everybody in this town has something to hide. Something darker that's lurking beneath the surface and just waiting to come out. And the show kind of kicks off when the body of one of their beloved local teenagers washes up on the shore of their river and he's been murdered. So Jason Blossom has been murdered. And this kicks off this whole story of, well, how could this happen? Who's done this? What's the story here? And through that unfolding, we get to know all of these characters that we once knew and loved from the comic books. Now, just going to say this outright, if you are a lover of murder mysteries, please do not watch this show for the murder mystery. It is absolutely dreadful. I am a real lover of murder mystery. I fantasized about writing my murder mystery. I was coming up with my own conspiracies about who did it, and my stories were way better than what they actually came up with. It just didn't even make much sense. But like the point is, they haven't created this show for the murder mystery, right? That's just the carriage. That's just the engine that kind of moves the story forward. What they're wanting to do is actually tell us something about these characters and what it reveals about human nature and our struggle. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the more popular characters and actually look at how they've evolved. And as we sit in that contrast, we're going to lead into what this is trying to teach us. So Archie, our headliner, Archie Andrews, is still like the old Archie. He's a budding musician, but that's about as far as the similar. Oh, and he's a redhead. Funnily enough, the actor is actually from New Zealand, and I laughed when I found this out. He's part Samoan, which is just hilarious that they've just stuck red hair on this Samoan kid. And as a natural redhead, I know I'm dark now, but as a natural redhead, I actually find it a bit offensive that they just took a good-looking brunette and put red hair on him. Anyway, and he still is somewhat torn between his feelings for Betty and Veronica, but that kind of takes a back seat because there's another sex scandal that's happening in Riverdale here, and I'll get onto that in a minute because it's really, really hilarious and fun. But there's so much, he's not the lovable klutz that we once knew. He is torn between his identities as a football superstar and a budding musician. And he's rebellious towards his parents to a certain degree, which again is just not in line with the Archie that we once knew. And he actually is withholding evidence in the case of Jason Blossom murder. And if you know the original Archie, honesty is just such a key part of his character. And so we see here that he isn't that same character we once knew. He really has changed and adapted for a modern audience. He's a lot darker than the original Archie. They all are. Jughead. Jughead in the comic books, well, you've read the comic books. What's Jughead like? Tell me, what's the most characteristic thing about Juggy?
He was the relief, the fun relief.
Yep, and he was characteristically asexual, right? He was never interested in girls, never interested in dating, and he saw the whole scene as kind of ridiculous, and because of that, it kind of set him outside of the normal teenager scene that would happen amongst the Archie and the gang. And because of this, he was a well-meaning prankster. He'd pull pranks on his friends and he'd amuse himself constantly. He also was passionate about food. Like, this was so core to his character. And again, you just see nothing of that in the Jughead Jones we find in Riverdale. Instead, Juggy is a brooding loner. He's misunderstood. He's very dark. He has this amazing ability to have insight where nobody else does, and he's actually writing a book on the Jason Blossom murder, and the narration of his book becomes the narration of the show. So he kind of becomes this really significant observational character that pulls the story together. He's also the son of a local gang member, which I find hilarious, and the crimes of this gang plague the town. And he's always trying to find his identity amongst, sort of torn between this loner and what his dad does and how people perceive him. And of course, he can't be asexual because in this day and age, your sexuality is your identity, so he has to have some kind of sexuality. So he's in love with Betty Cooper, which again just like messes with your mind when that first starts happening in the show, if you ever knew the original comic books. Betty in the comic books is the sweet girl next door who's in love with Archie. And she's still the sweet girl next door who is in love with Archie. But as she starts to try to meet everyone's expectations of being the perfect example of a good, sweet girl, she's actually battling those expectations and begins to struggle with her own issues with mental health. And at different times that seems to, she's battling self-harming tendencies, and she's plagued with this knowledge that there's been a history of mental health amongst her family. She also, at some points, has even these dissociative moments where she either thinks she's someone else and becomes very aggressive, or she becomes a really, really aggressive version of herself, and it just doesn't align with who she was sort of a few minutes before. She also has an emotionally manipulative and abusive mother who just never redeems herself through the series, which, side note, all the parents in this show are flipping crazy, right? They are more crazy than the kids, which becomes an interesting narrative in itself, but we don't have too much time, so I'm not going to get into it. Veronica Lodge in the original comic books was the pretty rich girl who was Betty's rival for Archie's attention. And because of her status amongst Riverdale, she was a bit of a snob. And because she was a bit of a snob, she could be quite mean to Betty and the people around her. She was a little bit of an antagonist in the original storyline. I find it interesting that Veronica is the only character who I feel is actually softened by the adaptation rather than hardened. Because in Riverdale, she is a victim of her father's corrupt business dealings. So her father's a very rich businessman and he's not on the straight and narrow. And so she's trying to find her own sense of self outside of that. She's trying to be a good person, and I actually think she's one of the more likeable characters that you find in Riverdale. This is my favourite one. In the comic books, Miss Grundy is a 70-year-old spinster music teacher at Riverdale High who's always just a little bit grumpy. But in Riverdale, she is young, she is gorgeous, and she is, of course, having a secret affair with Archie. And Archie and Miss Grundy, during one of their secret dates over the summer, they heard a gunshot in the woods. And this is the evidence that if they came forward could actually really help in what's happened to Jason Blossom and the murder, but they choose to conceal that information because they're afraid of being found out. And so, again, there's just not that sense of honesty and openness that we once found in Riverdale. A couple more last ones. Reggie Mantle, who was a core character in the original comic books, barely says a word in the 2 series, which I find really interesting because they made a deliberate decision to make him Asian because they're trying to bring some diversity into a town that didn't actually have a lot of it. I find it a really sad and missed opportunity that they chose to make him Asian and then never gave him any lines to say. And actually this show's had a lot of criticisms around their handling of minorities. Just to give an example of how they've made more attempts to bring diversity, Mr. Weatherby is now African American, as are all of Josie and the Pussycats, but once more they make these characters, they're trying to bring diversity into their show, but then they have very little to say, which is just such a shame. Archie's parents are played by Molly Ringwald and Luke Perry, who were the only 2 actors that I recognised when I first watched this show. Now, I found this fascinating within itself because I was wondering why a show aimed at the 15 to 20-year-old, the 2 famous actors they would choose are heartthrobs from the 1980s, right? The kids watching it would seriously have no idea who they are, which I'm going to get onto in just a second, what I believe the significance of that is. So, as I was watching this show, I kept coming back to this question: why Archie? Like, why did you have to use Archie to make this particular teen drama? Because you strip away the character names, you strip away the physical descriptions, and it's pretty much just any teenage drama, right? But for some reason, they've chosen to use Archie and to sit in this stark contrast. And I believe that the creators have actually done this really deliberately. Because it occurred to me that they're trying to make a strong statement to 2 relevant audiences who would be sitting down to watch this show. So the first one you have is the nostalgic audience. The people who read Archie, the people who were raised on it, who knew something of it, would go, oh, they made a TV show on Archie. I remember Archie, so I'm going to go sit down and watch this show. And where you see the Molly Ringwald and the Luke Perry, they're trying to actually target this nostalgic generation to say, this was you. Once upon a time, this was the Archie that you knew and you loved. But now, what you're watching and all of the shock of it, this is us. This is our life. These are our questions. These are our struggles. And it is shocking because the world we live in is so different to the world you grew up in. I actually think it's quite a deliberate and relevant thing that they're doing there. Because once upon a time, Archie stood for all that was virtuous in culture, all that they valued. And now they're showing what is virtuous, what we value, is starkly different, and you need to pay attention. I don't think they're trying to murder Archie. I think they're trying to think about who he would be in this time and in this age. If you go back to the classic comic books and you look at the things that Archie and the stories that tried to communicate good and healthy virtues and morals, they were things like value your family. They were all strong family units. Value your education, do your homework, go to school, achieve. Do the right thing, this elusive right thing. Be kind, be good to your friends. If you look at the values that come out through Riverdale, we see things like, yes, their relationships are really significant, but more than anything, their friendships are really significant, and I'll talk about that in just a little while. They value diversity. They value their choices and their rights in this world. They value a sense of justice and a sense of freedom. At the same time, if you look at the problems that the classic Archie comic books were facing on a daily basis, they were things like dating problems, misunderstandings, issues with schoolwork or their homework, fighting with their parents, and this idea that you had to kind of battle the wrong thing, right? Do the right thing and take down the wrong thing. Whereas if you look at the issues that this generation are facing, they're looking at issues with mental health, And when you look at those two lists, this list is describing the struggle of the current emerging generation. The things that Archie once had to deal with are not as much of an issue anymore, and what this TV show have done is gone, well, what is it these young people are struggling with? And how are we going to address them in our show? And I think they do it well. It's dramatised, it's ridiculous, and while the situation at hand is not a lot of, it's not the same as what young people deal with, the core of it is the same. The questions that they're asking are still really similar. Got a couple of minutes. So if we're to take a step back from all of that and to look at the overall meta-narrative, there's a fun word, of Archie, Riverdale, the old versus the new. If you're to look at the meta-narrative of what I would call your conventional classic superhero, there's this superhero and there's a right thing and a wrong thing, and the superhero pursues the right thing and they take down the wrong thing, right? And the superhero's friends, the right kind of friends, would join them in that pursuit. If at any stage one of those friends were beginning to align themselves with the wrong thing, it would be the responsibility of the hero to bring them back to the right side. And if they were to fail in that pursuit, then that friend is now a villain. It's sad, but that's the way it would go. Things were kind of neater. In Archie, there is a certain amount of things around them that help them to understand the difference between right and wrong. And they would be things like their parents, their authority figures like policemen and principals, their teachers, and maybe even God. However, when you look at the contemporary superhero, right, the superhero that we find more today in the Marvel movies and in Riverdale, we see that they're saying, well, it's not good enough to say there's a right thing or a wrong thing anymore, because life is just not that simple. It's actually really complicated, and we're surrounded by lots and lots of grey. And the things around us that used to help us to understand, so the contemporary teen, the things around us that used to help us to understand the difference between right or wrong, like parents, like teachers, like the authoritative figures, they're just as messed up and as broken as we are. We can't actually trust them anymore. And God, well, God is just non-existent. So then what are they supposed to pursue? What are these teenagers supposed to rely on to navigate this crazy world? And as you watch teen dramas, you'll see time and time again that the message that comes through is you can trust your friends. Your friends are all you've got. They're your support system. And we need to know how to be loyal to our friends. That matters above everything else. And that comes out really strongly in Riverdale. Sorry, I'm running over time. I'm going to try and wrap up. So here's my question for us as we sort of finish up. Classic Archie still had that sort of meta-narrative where there's the right thing and the wrong thing, and those characters would try to understand what it meant to pursue the right thing. And the reason it fit in so nicely with that evangelical Christian message is because at its core, that still was for many, many years the way we communicated the gospel into the world, right? Jesus is the right thing. He's going to help you to understand how to do the right thing. I'm not saying that's wrong. I still believe that's right. But my question is, the way we communicate that message, is it actually falling on open ears? Are we communicating it in a way that this current generation can understand? Because this is what these guys are looking for. And I'm not just talking about Riverdale. I work with teenagers. They're asking these questions. They're looking for hope in a world of grey. They're looking for some light. They're looking for clarity because everything's very confusing. They want that sense of freedom. They want justice. They want diversity. The gospel embodies these things. The answers are already there. My question is, are we still trying to communicate the gospel in this way, or are we shaping our language and the way we target it to this generation and the questions that they're asking? That's something that I actually think the creators of Riverdale have done really well. So that's it for me. I had to rush it towards the end there, but I have, I think, 1 or 2 more minutes for discussion, questions, observations, if anyone has any. Yeah.
Obviously, the Archie is the creators being prescriptive. Do you think Riverdale creators are being prescriptive, or they're just trying to be reflective?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I found this really interesting when I was doing research. one of the main creators of all these modern versions of Archie, and there were some comic books where they made attempts to kind of be relevant to this culture before they created Riverdale. He actually recognised that Archie was going to die unless they did something different. So it could be reactive in some senses, but yeah, I'm not entirely certain. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm a parent of a 10-year-old.
Okay.
And it just amazes me how much of this actually relates to my 10-year-old.
Yes.
It's a scary world for a parent,
Yep.
and obviously for my child.
Yeah.
And so I think you've really hit the nail on the head. I think it's very much an accurate reflection.
Cool. And I think we do need to be on the front foot with the exposure and the access to information that these people never had. We do need to be on the front foot and to be thinking about how we actually... and because of the level of grey, I think it's not enough to protect our kids. We need to equip them to actually handle this. So then how do we equip them and actually teach them to navigate it rather than shy away from it? Because I think the reason we've sat in that old system so long is because it's really hard to adjust things like sexuality and mental health and put a theology to that that's makes us feel comfortable. But because of the amount of grey that they're navigating, we need to know how to help them to navigate the grey.
How do you help them to navigate the grey? Do you use Riverdale?
I think absolutely you can use Riverdale to because that's a world that they know.
So how do you use that?
So I would want them to be identifying with those characters and then talking out how they would respond in those situations and pointing them to choices that actually still sit in those things that they value, but point them back to Jesus, because we still do need to point them back to Jesus. He's not grey, right? That's not the do we trust Jesus, don't we? That's the absolute yes. The key is how do we actually help them to see that Jesus is the answer amongst their world? If that answers your question, it's a little bit clunky. Do we have to finish up?
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.